operates programs advancing equity, CS education, and the tech workforce, and strategically partners with organizations advancing practices and policies to expand racial equity in technology industry. So I want to give a warm welcome to Emma.
Well, thank you so much. Hopefully everyone online can hear me. Thank you so much for coming today, and thank you for the invitation. I'm a big fan of Aman. We work closely on a number of different projects. But beyond that, I'm just really excited to be here to talk about some of our work and to also engage in a dialogue and have conversation about what you all are seeing, what you all are researching, and ways that we might end up collaborating together. Oops. Help. Just press this one.
Let's try it. Yep.
That should work. Okay, great. Thank you, guys. Okay, so a little bit about my organization. So the Kapor Center, this is a picture of our building. We're located in downtown Oakland, California. How many of y'all have visited Oakland? Anyone? Please come visit us. We'd love to have you. I'm mesmerized by the snow right now. So if you see me like glancing out the window, we do not get snow. So our focus is to create a more equitable tech ecosystem that addresses longstanding racial inequality, creates economic opportunity, and reflects the power and potential and perspectives of communities of color. And so I run the foundation. The foundation is an operating foundation, a very unique mechanism by which to influence the systems. And I'm able to work with fantastic colleagues like Kalisha Davis here, who's in the front row, working on some great projects related to culturally responsive computing. We also have, for those that are interested in the broader tech ecosystem, Kapor Capital is our venture capital firm. It's led by two partners who invest in seed stage startup companies. There are about 120 currently in the portfolio that are all focused on social impact. And when we think about the tech ecosystem, while most of my talk today will be about K-12 computer science education, we're thinking about the entire ecosystem. So we're thinking about what happens in K-12 and how that influences what then happens in higher education, how that influences representation in the workforce, and then thinking even more broadly about who invests in technology companies, who creates technology companies, and how does that contribute to the overall cycle of the tech ecosystem. So before I get started, just a little bit about my journey into this work, which I think is helpful to think about the orientations that I bring to bear in these conversations. So I got my undergraduate degree from Hampton University in psychology. And so I'm very interested in understanding things like identity and motivation and engagement and what drives different perspectives and different perspectives from diverse communities and ways in which disparities impact groups differently. And then I went to Berkeley for graduate school, and I think there's some similarities with our orientation at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Education, which is really centering equity and inclusion at all levels across its programs. And so now that I've been out in the world, I realize not everyone has that centering and that grounding in their educational journeys. My orientation also is heavily driven by understanding racial inequality was my main focus in education. So I think about things from the lens of racism and racial inequality in education. And I am a researcher by heart. So you'll see through my presentation, hopefully I won't bore you, but I love data and I love the ability of data to tell stories and to hopefully like motivate people to drive change. And I'm really just hearing a little bit about each of your backgrounds and the folks that are joining here today. I'm really excited about this interdisciplinary conversation because I think the ways that we all approach the conversation around equity and justice in computing and bringing multiple different lenses to bear will just strengthen this space. And of course, before I get started, I really want to acknowledge sincere thanks and gratitude to all of the scholars, all of the researchers, educators, students, colleagues, funders, and advisors who have like supported my own professional journey. Like I don't stand up here describing these concepts and my perspectives as someone who came to them by myself, but somebody who came to them through a lot of engagement, back and forth dialogue, and deep respect for a lot of the scholars that I've read, including many from this institution. and provided some of this knowledge for us to continue to build on in pursuit of a better future. So wanted to start there. So in terms of grounding the conversation, wanted to talk about our national tech economy and talk about some data. So we know that our tech sector plays an increasingly significant role in our national economy. The net tech employment is actually down. We have a whole other set of conversations about what's happening in the tech sector right now around layoffs and pulling back on some of the investments, but 8.7 million net tech employment in the country, producing 1.9 trillion in yearly economic output, and overall a trend of increase in tech-related jobs year over year. But when we look at the representation in the tech sector by race and gender, we see profound disparities across the sector and among the largest tech companies. So overall in the workforce, you'll see underrepresentation among Black and Latino workers, and also underrepresentation among women. And at the Capeware Center, we've been following this data for quite some time, as there's been a number of different efforts to expand diversity in tech and in Silicon Valley, and you'll hear time after time about the hiring of chief diversity officers and maybe reporting on data metrics. But overall, when you look at the data, there's been very little progress. So this is a little bit small, I think, for some folks to see, but the graph on the right is from our State of Black Tech Diversity Report, which shows that there's been very little progress among Black representation among companies like Google, Cisco, Dell, Facebook, LinkedIn, Microsoft, Salesforce, Twitter, et cetera. And we're seeing the same things in terms of representation of Black talent among leadership. So who are the leaders that are making decisions within these companies? We're seeing underrepresentation. This graph shows Black representation in executive leadership roles, but we'll see a very similar trend for Latinx representation, Indigenous representation, as well as women. And then on the venture capital and entrepreneurship side, we're very interested in thinking about, again, where does investment come from? Who's investing in which types of entrepreneurs, and what are the types of products that they're creating? As we all know, the creation of technology companies all comes back to investors. And so this is data from 2022. Just 1% of all VC investment goes to Black entrepreneurs. So the number up at the top is $288.4 billion overall was invested, venture capital investment in tech companies. And the number at the bottom is 3.7 billion invested in Black founded companies. So really small numbers. In addition, looking at the most recent data, we only have data from Q3, but that number is actually declining. So we're actually at about 0.5% of all VC investment from Q3 was going to Black entrepreneurs. So we're actually doing even less well. So we're not making any progress here. And I should say there was a little spike, and this might get us into other conversations. There was a little spike in increased investment after the murder of George Floyd, where there was oh, we should make some commitments and we should invest dollars. And there was a small spike, and then now it's back down and actually even lower than it was before. So in sum, as we think about the broader space of the tech ecosystem, we know that diverse representation, diverse being very broad, diverse representation is critical in the design, the deployment of technologies, and the decision-making about their use and their impact on communities. So really want to stress that point, that it's not just about representation or counting numbers and who's in an engineering role within a company, but how does it contribute to this overall ecosystem that impacts all of our lives. Couple more slides, and then I promise I want to engage with y'all. And so in addition to the lack of representation, we also see that communities of color are both underrepresented and then most likely negatively impacted by technologies. So this example here on the left is Dr. Joy Buolamwini, whose research did a fantastic job talking about the difference in facial recognition accuracy based on skin color. There was actually this citation here, there was actually a replication among the US government did a meta-analysis and found the same thing among top performing facial recognition software misidentifying Blacks at a rate 5 to 10 times more than whites. When you think about it, like we're using facial recognition a lot. Like I don't know if anyone's traveled internationally recently and had the face scan. So accuracy is a real problem. And it's a huge problem if we think about things like on the right, facial recognition software being used among police departments to think about how to track down criminals. This gentleman was wrongfully arrested, and it took quite a bit of undoing to demonstrate that he was not the person in the image, because they were just using the software that had a black box of data that no one knew where it came from, and it was very hard to articulate the ways in which bias was creeping in there. And then this most recent, the last one here, this most recent piece of data was demonstrating how algorithms were leading to an increase in denial among Black, Latinx, and Asian home loan applicants. So real economic impacts on communities of color as well. So our central argument here is that we believe that technology and computing education as a core point of the technology ecosystem is central to the fight for racial justice. Maybe I'll stop there. Any thoughts or reflections? This is fun. I feel like I'm teaching hours. But no, I don't want to just lecture. I would love interaction or reflections, or is this an oversimplification? Any? Yeah.
So quick question in terms of, and often when we talk about underrepresentation, we look at it slightly differently at each of the different levels of development and whatever. Here, is it underrepresentation versus the general population, underrepresentation versus the people graduating with tech-related degrees, or how's that computed out? Which is a little bit also a question of how much of it is our fault at the universities for not producing enough tech graduates, right? Versus what's really going on in the VC and entrepreneurial.
Totally. Great question. I think that there's challenges at each stage of the pipeline. The data question is, we're looking at underrepresentation relative to the overall population, one, but then two, specifically with Black graduates, you'll see that there are more CS graduates than the number getting hired into tech companies. So then that indicates to us that there's something happening in the recruitment and the hiring process. So hopefully that answers your question. I think there's a lot of blame to go around. I don't want to say blame, but I can't come up with another question. Yeah.
Michigan, 17% of our population is Black, but only 4.5% of the students, Black students, are in computer science courses, right? So in terms of underrepresentation, it's even at the K-12 level.
Right. It's impacting us as educators, or we're the problem as educators. But then if of those 4% that graduate with CS degrees, only 2% end up working in the industry, right? And that's another tier, right, in the chain. And that seems to be what you're saying.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I have some more data on that to come. Yes, in the back.
Yeah, is this statement the U.S. centric, or is it broader than that?
Yeah.
I worry about the things, right? I certainly worry about the things that you presented, but I also worry about the surveillance state, right? And how folks in China are treated.
Mm-hmm.
So how does this statement relate to that?
Fantastic question. I will say you're absolutely right that our focus as an organization is very US centric, but the things that we're concerned about have global implications, as you're saying. So some of the things, I'll talk a little bit more about things related to technology policy. And it's very hard to distinguish between, the ways in which mis and disinformation can be weaponized against marginalized groups. That's international. I mean, we've seen what played out in Myanmar, for example, right? So really appreciate that point, because I think it's critically important. And as we think about how to push for more tech accountability, I think we have to have the international lens. So thank you for that point.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bing. It's really wonderful work. There's something troubling, and I can't articulate it very well, so please forgive me, about the spike you mentioned right after the death of George Floyd, and then it coming down. And at one time we say, people are trying to be responsive. But I also wonder what that says about the relationship between violence towards Black bodies
Mhm.
and then when that happens, people feeling like they need to act and that being on such public display. Like, what does that say? Like, what type of racial justice so that when people don't get killed, so that we have investment in Black capital? Like I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
No.
It feels very troubling. It seems like that says something very disturbing.
Absolutely.
About our race in the U.S.
Absolutely. Different tangents of reaction. Two quick points. One is just looking at what we tried to track too is all of the commitments. So there was like hundreds of millions of dollars. I was talking to Madison about this. Hundreds of millions of dollars committed. There were all kinds of statements. And I think that was a good thing in that for whatever reason, this set of factors forced almost everyone across almost every sector to say like, what are we doing and what should we be doing differently? The critique that I have is, I could go on for days. The critique that I have is even amongst those dollars, like there was some analysis that was like, okay, of the like, it seems like, oh, $100 million committed to racial equity. Well, that's like 0.001%. It's like a rounding error of like, it's not core to your business still. And so I think it's still not core to any of our strategies. And I think that's the critique, whether it's in tech, in higher ed, in K-12, and in VC. And then your point, the last point I really think is important for this conversation too, as we think about education is, how are we equipping young people with a deep understanding of the constructs of racism and the constructs of inequality and the constructs of like, how do we break down those structural barriers? That is a point where I think we really have a lot of work to do, like in the K-12 space. So hopefully that like can drive some of the conversations that we have.
Yeah, because people, it shouldn't be the visceral react, like,
Yes.
horrible, we should respond to that, but it's not like violence and harm isn't being done every day.
Yes.
Right?
And then, sorry, the one other point, and then I think there were two other hands. The one other point was we did not, I mean, in some instances, like we saw, for example, we saw like in one instance, the like prosecution and conviction of an individual, but we didn't see like systemic change in the criminal justice system. And I think that's emblematic too of some of the problems. Like we're not getting to like structural reform. Yes.
Question, what, and basically why education? And if you take the example of women, started with, so I have the privilege to look at the U.S. as an outsider sometimes, and this country has sometimes it seems only its power to not to encourage things or not to get like it doesn't support it, doesn't subsidize daycare, doesn't have a reasonable maternity leave as in other Western countries. So I wanted to ask myself whether it's not a more policy question that relates to the government, and it's not us. Of course, we educators have some responsibility, but I ask myself whether it's there to put on our shoulders all this responsibility. It's not actually those in the Congress and who should take this full responsibility to really shift how things look like and really make those underrepresented groups be represented.
You must have been in conversations in our organization. Like they always joke that I'm like obsessed with policy and politics, because for that very point, like we can do a lot, but there still has to be a level of policy change. And so we'll talk a little bit in this conversation too about ideas for policy change. I totally agree. We can do things. We cannot change systems without policy change. So. Was there another question? Okay. If not, I will keep us rolling. Okay, so I wanted to talk about we talked about the tech sector and the context of underrepresentation in the tech sector. Then I wanted to talk about computer science education. And specifically, while this might not be the case for many in this room, Aman knows this, there are many conversations in computing more broadly, computing disciplines more broadly, about whether computing is a pure discipline and should stay apolitical, or whether computing sits in this larger context and we should explore these topics within computing. So I just wanted to kind of frame this around what we see as the social, political, educational context in which computing education sits. So there's a lot here. I'll start with, I think, as we think about what technologies, pros, cons, in between, the ways in which information is being weaponized, the ways in which data is being weaponized to negatively impact communities of color. We know that there's an increase in radicalization, white supremacy, extremism, hate crimes, I can go on. Many of those can be tied back to technology and social media platforms. I could go down a whole rabbit hole on that, but that's I would argue, of importance as we're thinking about computer science education and having young people explore computing, and even thinking about whether they want to enter into computing related fields. I really like this one for those who have young people at home. I have nephews, and I know this is true. So it's huge increase in the number of young people who rely on social media for news. And even social media savvy teens can't spot a news story. So this is really around, like, I mean, arguably this could be more like digital literacies, but I think it's a really important topic to engage in conversation with young people about, starting there, then digging into, like, well, what are the algorithms behind, what are the, like, business models driving disinformation? And then I think a really important political context, we talked a little bit about the murder of George Floyd. There has been a shift. This was a really important research article about the public discourse related to Black Lives Matter, or really the concern around racial inequality. Now, that is not as though that has not been met with backlash, but what we see overall is, like, some interest in understanding what is the current kind of state of racial equality in this country. Educational context. So y'all are very familiar with this data. Just want to frame it because sometimes our computing colleagues forget this. We still have significant disparities in education more broadly, not just in computing education. So disparities in school funding, disparities in, this is a picture that happened at the height of the pandemic in California of young people on their laptops outside of a Taco Bell. Like, broadband infrastructure, the ability to engage in distance learning was a huge challenge. The NAEP scores, well, obviously we know they're just one indicator of performance, but for the first time showed a decline in math and reading since 1990, arguably some symbol of what happened during the pandemic, but disparities exist. And then something that's, I think, of huge importance and would love to get your thoughts on is just the whole field of education and teachers being under attack in multiple different ways, and the deprofessionalization of teachers. Teachers are leaving and not wanting to join the field. So we need educators for all of the reasons that we know, but the context is it's becoming a less desirable profession. And then the political context. Okay, so arguably, in my opinion, a backlash to Black Lives Matter movement has been the increase in policies, to the policy point, policies restricting conversations in education and classrooms around, they say critical race theory, but really relates to the contributions of specific racial or ethnic groups or related topics. The red are all of the states, and this is, like, not even an updated version. So this is happening across the country. We work with partners in Georgia where our partners who are working in CS education can't say the words equity, can't attend conferences that have equity in titles. Faculty their syllabi are being scoured for words like race and equity. So the whole political context is alarming if we're thinking about how we're trying to increase equity in computing. The same thing is happening around anti-LGBTQ bills, impacting marginalized groups and specifically targeting trans people. And then just more broadly, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, polarization of that might seem like, okay, this is a political political science concept, what does that mean in classrooms? What does that mean for teachers who are teaching students? What does that mean in communities that are highly polarized? And then this one also might feel a little convoluted, but I think it's an important political context to think about. We're now realizing that we need to invest more in our homegrown talent, I guess is the best way to say this. And so what does that mean for computer science education? And then the economic context, this is data that is like everyone's probably familiar with, but I thought it's important to highlight again. The tech wages obviously are significantly higher than median wages. And we've seen that in Oakland, like there's a direct impact on communities of color who are not represented in tech companies. And so leading to things like gentrification, increase in homelessness, et cetera. And then just the overall workforce development trends indicate that automation will impact many different communities in many different ways, but will most specifically impact African-American men. So something for us to be considering. And then the racial wealth gap has grown over 3 decades as opposed to closed. So this is all the context in which we find ourselves in computing. Any thoughts or reactions to those? Anything that I missed? Social, political, economic? Cool. Okay, I'll keep going. Okay, so then now we find ourselves in the CS landscape. And I really wanted to make sure to get through those other points first, because oftentimes we just jump in here. And I think you guys have seen these data points around like how many schools offer computer science, and we kind of jump in here and then try to make changes without thinking about the broader context. So super familiar to all of you too, but just wanted to state why we think this is important. Computational literacies are needed across all fields, all future occupations, and for engaging in our tech-driven society. Wanted to make sure to point out we're not saying computational thinking and computer science is needed for jobs. And I think that's a huge distinction. We heard that earlier today. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that too. So the national landscape of CS education, I'll try to go through these data points pretty quickly and then get your thoughts. 53% of schools offer computer science. Michigan up here is at 46% of high schools. California here is at 40%. Interestingly, Arkansas is at 92%. There's a lot to deconstruct here. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention what Aman always talks about, which is access is just one indicator. So you can have one course. That doesn't mean that the course is like well taught. That doesn't mean that there are more than 15 students in the course. But still, that means there are 47% of high schools that don't offer anything. And also, we're not thinking about, we don't have the data yet, but we're not thinking about elementary and middle school as well. And then this is critically important that we have in the computer science ed space for at least the last 10 years that we've been tracking the data around expand computer science for all students. We still have huge gaps in access by race and ethnicity. So Black Latinx students are less likely to have access. More importantly, low-income students are much less likely to have access. Not more importantly, equally importantly, rural students are less likely to have access. So looking at this 53%, there's a lot of disaggregation needed to focus in on where the most impact needs to be had. So I pulled the data from Michigan. I think this is what Aman was mentioning. 74%. I don't know why this is 74. Sorry, the two numbers don't add up. This is from Code.org. The two numbers don't add up. But I think this is a really interesting one, which is regardless of how high it is, let's say between 50 to 70% offer computer science courses, but just 25% of high poverty schools. So, low income students are still less likely to have access. Girls are still underrepresented. And this point, I don't think, that was your point here, Aman, about Black students, 17% of the population, but just 3% of the AP exam test takers in Michigan. Are you guys getting tired of my data? Yeah.
Physics, we found both data on like the number of courses that are offered. But we also have data on the universities of those courses at like pre-line grade level. Like, we know how many students take connected physics, you know, how what stuff is it? Is that data available? Yeah, so it seems like it's CS. So this might be my experience with like what CS courses are, what the concept.
Really great question. So the data for Michigan, I don't have, and I'm not sure if y'all have it. So code.org is like the national org that collects all of the data. For California, we go in through like California Department of Education and pull all the courses. So we can get to that level of granularity. I just don't have it for. But to your point, like that was a perfect transition too to this, just on AP is like the raw numbers. So there's percentages of high schools that offer the courses, but raw numbers on AP CS enrollment. And this is over the last 6 years. This includes when we added the AP Computer Science Principles course, which was intended to broaden participation. And what we see on the yellow trend is like there's a very marginal increase in the number of Black students compared to all students. So for us, that's really like alarming and indicates some of our policies and practices need to be addressing the fact that it can't just be an all movement. And then, again, just one indicator of success. I was talking to David about this yesterday. Computer science we don't have assessments in the same way that the other disciplines have assessments. So just one indicator of success or achievement is AP passage rates. And even amongst those, we see, so of the students who take the courses, there are huge disparities in passage rates, which tells us not that there's something wrong with the students, but that the quality of the courses are not equally distributed. And then this might go to your question, which I thought was an interesting data point, kind of very disheartening data point. So we were looking at this data for our State of Black Tech Diversity Report. So across all institutions, we know like we've seen a huge increase in the number of students who want to major in computer science. But the number of Black students, the percentage of Black students earning CS degrees is actually declining. That for us, and we have like some anecdotal evidence, that for us indicates that there are a lot of gatekeeping things happening in higher education. So the interest might be there, students might have taken the course if they had access to the course, but then there are also a set of bars and hurdles that they need to jump over to get into the major. So and not to mention a whole other set of like cultural climate factors that may influence persistence in computing. Yeah. Great question. So the decline here as a percentage is relative to like white percentage overall of the post-secondary population.
So there's more, okay. So there is some increase in the other groups, so that's fine in the overall.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, great question.
That's not the case, right? All of, like literally every one of those lines went down, right? So that's amazing. Right? In 2016, 2020, every group declined. There's maybe non-resident, not even that moment.
I think this is the degrees conferred versus enrollment.
Enrollment
at the CS.
So all of our CS programs are just brutally destroying people.
doing a terrible job. Wow.
So like, there's a lot of shifting around.
Right.
Thank you for helping me unpack the reasoning behind the data. I appreciate it. Two more data points and then we'll open it up too. So we also did a quick survey. It just so happened our CS teacher survey happened at the same time COVID happened. So we were able to ask teachers what their perspectives were around CS teaching. And I believe this was the data was collected in July 2020. So 24% of CS teachers in high poverty schools and 34% in rural schools said that they had to suspend instruction completely, CS instruction completely, for a variety of reasons. Like some examples were, we really need to focus in on the core subject areas, or we need things like technology and broadband access, and it was becoming impossible to do. And then 52% of CS teachers reported distance learning presenting major challenges and things like digital divide issues. So, I mean, common sense things, but I think things that were helpful for us to hear as a computer science education community to think about what are some of the strategies by which we can overcome some of these ongoing challenges. And then this is just a very crude summary of this much longer CS teacher landscape report. So I encourage folks to check that whole report out if they want more detailed information. And also we're getting ready to release a second version next week, so it'll have updated data. But we wanted to get a sense of who are the CS teachers? So there's a bunch of demographic data in there. The CS teacher population, at least amongst those that replied to the survey, appeared to very much mirror the teacher population. So overwhelmingly white and female, which is interesting. 65% of the teachers believe that the existing materials met the needs of a diverse student body. 59% felt confident utilizing material highlighting race, ethnicity, and culture, which goes back to like our teacher preparation and PD opportunities. 53% felt that current CS content is culturally relevant and in alignment with students' interests. And again, that's broad, like they could be defining this in their own ways. And 57% felt equipped to utilize culturally relevant pedagogical practices in their classrooms. The last point I think is really interesting and gets to like the orientations that teachers are bringing to the classroom. 61% saw the importance of covering computing's role in perpetuating bias related to racism, sexism, and other inequities. And nearly 40% did not necessarily see this as core to computer science. So just that last data point, thinking about all of the work that you do with teachers, or like in a PD session or in a school, the breakdown in the like perspectives that folks might have around computing, I think is a really important piece to consider. Okay. Lots of data. What are some other obstacles that y'all are seeing? I got to hear from some of our fantastic grad students earlier. What are some of the other obstacles that are creating these continued disparities? Yeah. I don't know it off the top of my head, but the data is in the report. What I do remember is that there's a huge breakdown, and unlike other disciplines, and this is one of the challenges that we can go into, teacher certification for computing is all over the place. And so some teachers were standalone CS teachers, some teachers were in elementary, but reflected that they were teaching some level of computing. Some had like 1 to 2 years of experience. Some had, 20 years of experience. So it was kind of a mixed bag, but I think a lot of interesting data for thinking about like, what are the what are the actions that are needed around like teacher preparation. So, sorry that I don't have the data off the top of my head. Yes.
In Michigan, we don't require any certification.
Can you please talk some more about that? Because I think that's very.
Yeah, so a few years ago, in order to gain access to computer science, code.org primarily convinced the Department of Education to get rid of certification requirements to use computer science, right? Because access is more important than the quality of instruction. And it's reflected in similar data too, like Black students passed the AP exam at 48% in Michigan compared to overall pass rate of 78%. Michael and I did this summer in Detroit, and one of the teachers quoting, "I was bullied into teaching computer science. I've only taught English all my life." Right? Because the school wanted to offer computer science, right? And so that's the landscape, especially within schools that have predominantly student products.
There's another example from our colleagues in Georgia. Georgia passed this state bill a couple years ago requiring high schools to offer computer science, which is like, we think overall is like, you know, a promising practice, but then it has to follow, like we have to have all of these other things in place. And there was a teacher whose classroom we were in who was teaching AP computer science, and her students were just on computers, like trying to figure it out on code.org's website. And she was a business teacher and she taught business for like 30 years. I had no clue what computer science was.
We had a licensed program, but as soon as state got rid of it, we took it out.
So all of, oh, sorry.
Yes. And then,
So all of the data that you're presenting, right, you know, maps to exactly what's going on in science, mathematics, right, and other things that, and we recognize those issues of inequity and things kind of as deeply seated in policy and culture. What's unique about CS? Right, so in what area are you seeing that the progress of CS is better or worse, right, than kind of what's going on in all of the other steps?
fantastic question. This is totally just my opinion. So some of the differences, two of the differences. One, I think there's an opportunity, which is that there are a lot of things yet to be defined. So we're just talking about how we don't have assessments. Like, could we envision a different way to do assessments and accountability in computer science? Like, that's still up for discussion and debate. So that's interesting. So we know there are disparities. Can we try to address them at relatively the outset of this space? So I think that's an opportunity. One thing that's may not be different, but I think is a really important point as you're bringing up like science and math and disparities that we've seen continually in these spaces is we talk a lot about like the individual computer science course, but computing and computational thinking and computational principles arguably need to be in every single course. And so if we take, I would argue, if we have a justice lens for computing, like that goes from K through 12, and that it goes across all subject areas. There's in any course that you're teaching, you could pull in computational thinking practices. You could pull in examples about things that are happening, like the social, political, cultural impacts of computing into those courses. So I think there's another opportunity for computing to be more fully integrated across courses. Not that math or science don't have that same principle, but I think it's an interesting opportunity for computing.
So can I push on that for a moment?
Sure.
Because whenever we want to add something, right, everybody taught K-12 knows that
You got to subtract something.
What would you drop?
Oh,
Right?
gosh.
You're going to add those things in, it necessarily means, absent the government suddenly showering us with more teachers and money and things like that, right, that something else gets removed. So what would you remove to make room for it?
Such a good question. I don't, two different thoughts. One, I would love, this is just like my pie in the sky vision. I would love for all of us and many more who are not in the room and community members to think about, like, we talk about this all the time, but like, let's reimagine education. Like, we're still stuck in the same models of education, and we're like, okay, we'll take this out and add this. And so, but what are all the things that we need if we're looking at like 20 years in the future? So that's kind of where my mind goes. Realistically, you're absolutely right. Like a teacher that's teaching 4 courses of math and 2 courses of computer science, if you want them to add 4 more courses of computer science, who's going to teach that math course is a very realistic challenge that I don't necessarily have an answer for at this point.
Like as you and I were talking about earlier, like, is more computing going to lead to racial justice, right? Given that it's a zero-sum game, like, why do we teach 4 years of math? Like, who made that rule, right? Or we were talking in we were meeting with Allison with grad students that we looked at the curriculum from 1967 when Purdue offered the first CS major to now. Nothing has changed. We still require Calc 1, Calc 2, discrete math. Like, world has moved on, but we just, have it the same spot. Like, what are the reasons for it, right?
to also respond to what you're gonna take out, I feel like a lot of people take as a given, computer science means programming.
Mm-hmm.
And people are like, oh, we have to spend, you're gonna take a year doing a little bit of programming in CS principles, then do another year doing programming in CSA. If you take out the programming and add other aspects of computing, because for most, vast majority of students who K-12 students who take computer science, they're not gonna be programmers. Programming, not that useful to them.
Mm-hmm.
What will be useful to them is understanding the role that computing play in their everyday lives in society. When we do like science education, we're not trying to train them to be really good at the bench. That's not the goal. We want students to understand the role of science in their lives and how it affects them. Similarly, I think the goal of computer science in K-12 should be to help students understand what the role of computing is in their everyday lives and the relevant information that they need to know. Not necessarily, oh, you gotta be good at paper, you gotta know how to, reverse a linked list, stuff like that.
And to add to what Allison, you just said, like Allison's point about, like it needs to be justice-oriented ways of computing within these disciplines is also important.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Learn how algorithms.
Right. Absolutely.
Standards, science, like some reason that documented that at least like major things that you need to have on an academy. Basic course and entry level, middle school level. Is there such a document?
Yes, there are K-12 standards. There are not national standards, as we don't need to go into that debate. There are K-12 standards, and then each state has their own standards. So each state can adopt like the existing K-12 standards or a version. So like California has our own state standards that were adopted, I believe 2018. The challenge then becomes you have standards, you have a strategic plan, and this goes back to your question about what do you take out. We're literally in the process still of debating in California. How do you incentivize, encourage, hold people accountable for teaching computer science according to those standards, and we don't have anything in place. And so one of the questions is like, should we add computer science to the state dashboard? The dashboard like looks at all these different indicators, but then the science community is like, well, science is not on the dashboard. That's a fair point. Science is not on the dashboard. So are we saying we should substitute science for computer science? We don't necessarily think that's the right solution. Then it gets very, very complicated. But yes, there are standards is my answer. Yeah.
One of the main obstacles actually is the definition of equity, right? That like access is equity, because if that's the case, right, then we're doing a great job. Like we've grown access for years. But with data being trying to unpack with the behaviors, it's like the number of behaviors has gone up, so those proportions go down. But it's not a big nutrition problem. So like, what's a stronger definition of that? Start from.
I think it's a super, super important point. And actually, yes, it's needed. I think the definitions of equity have definitely become very watered down or maybe just misunderstood. An evolution of like discussions of what equity means and what we're actually advocating for, I think is super important. Was there another question? Yeah.
So I was very surprised to see Alabama be at 5%, right? I feel it as a Alabama thing.
Yes.
Participated in numerous ways over the years, right? What is the reporting for what is considered CS, right? So I can say that I appreciate the CS course, but I know that the course that I took that was my CS course was a business administration class.
Right.
I know, but or if I'm taking the CS course and there's a third of the semester that you spend, but the rest of the semester is on typing and media literacy instead of like programming, or even if it's not programming, computational like that. I would consider some of the courses that are being reported as CS it as a kid. Even if it's
Absolutely.
not, it's not, business administration is not typing stuff.
Absolutely. You've hit on a super important data point. So the data, again, as like a relatively new space, the data from code.org relies on states to self-report what they're collecting, and there's no cross-referencing with the standards. So no one's saying like this course meets these standards. It's really based at this point on like course codes and titles. And there's a whole project being done with like the ESEP folks around like common metrics. So at least just trying to get all the states on board with like, are we counting the same courses in the same way? You know, we're debating like, does web design count? Does digital literacy count? Like every state is kind of coming down differently. But then the other point, which we'll get to on the recommendations, is that there's been a big push for state level policy. And so some of the states that you see have increased the large numbers have policies like mandate all high schools offer computer science. That gets back to our access versus like equity argument. So they might offer computer science, like back to the Georgia example, your example in Alabama, your example in Detroit, but what is actually being taught is a very different question. And so we're arguing like, what's the next wave of equitable policies that we need? Yes, David.
Yeah, so I would just love to hear you speak for a minute about, we were talking a little bit about this, but I think it's becoming more alarming to me when I see the data that we're talking about. So the schools aren't all, well, we know who's filling in the gaps for a lot of places. It's that it's Microsoft, it's Google. They're coming in and they're doing things like code to power. But if they're replicating all the racial biases and all the things we were talking before, that doesn't seem to be. And so, do you have thoughts about like, is there a role for those private companies to build like building apps or whatever you want to call it in public schools that are other people? Or like, should we hold them accountable for reproducing the next? I don't know. I would love to hear your thoughts about like they're here, they're doing stuff.
Yeah.
Like what do we need to do for them or with them?
This is totally the elephant in the room in like computer science education. Yeah. Thank you, David. I will pontificate for a second. So full disclosure, we have funding from some of these organizations. So like we have funding from google.org, for example, that allows us to do, not allows us, we could have done it, but allows us to do the like culturally responsive computing initiative. My very broad stroke summary of what I see that's happened, and I'd love other reflections, is that industry has woken up to the fact that we need K-12 computer science education for industry purposes, and realized what the data shows and said, how can we engage? And so there's a lot of money being invested. My argument is that it's not invested in structural solutions. So David and I were talking last night about how schools of education are working with industry partners and or if they are. We had a pilot with Berkeley that was just because like I happen to have gone to Berkeley and we're in the backyard with using Google funding to support like teacher scholarships to try to figure out professional development and learning and computing, even in the absence of having a credential. That was just a pilot, but I think examples like that are what's needed versus Microsoft and Google developing curriculum and trying to do training. The other piece on the other elephant in the room, Aman mentioned some of it, but there is a big push. So industry is funding a lot of advocacy work that helps to pass the policies that we see across the states. In the best case scenario, they think this is what would be most effective to increase access. It's clearly not addressing racial disparities. And again, it's not a structural solution. So. Yeah, and I was talking to David about like the ways in which the lobbying has happened in computer science education has been really fascinating, and looking at who's supporting what. TechNet, are y'all familiar with TechNet? They're like the tech industry, like what is it called? Like lobbying firm. So they are very supportive of computer science education. The question is, do we have the right policies to tell them to advocate for? I have one other quick example if anyone. Kalicia's probably heard this story like a million times. Let me watch the time too. In California, in the last election, 2020, so Google, Facebook, all of these folks that are right in our backyards, they've all poured a bunch of money into the local districts to support like professional development. That's great. That's wonderful. We like that. But are those like structural solutions? So the minute Salesforce money goes away or Intel money goes away, what happens to those districts? And there was a proposition on the ballot, Proposition 13, which was going to address property taxes. So like a marginal increase on corporate taxes that would then fund schools and communities. Like, okay, we know what the disparities are in school funding, blah, blah, blah. The tech industry like did not support that proposition and use their lobbying to, I guess maybe I'm on camera, to come out against that. So like we're not, we're, you know, on the one hand, there's like, it's great that you've invested, you know, the press release is like $1 million for like Oakland Unified Computer Science Initiative. And then on the other hand, like there's nothing, you're advocating against structural change. So hopefully that helps on my overall take. Yeah.
It's sort of like effective altruism that I know what to do best with my money. Don't take it away from me.
Right.
I'll decide
Right.
what I give it to.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
And in thinking about this question, kind of thinking about like the entities that are funding and wanting CS expertise. I mean, I wonder if that is the obstacle to CS. Ebony O. McGee has wonderful research on this idea called the equity ethic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a lot of small end work, but it's still important, where she showed that Latino and Black college students, more so than white students, actually value when their work in college or their career is going to contribute to equity goals, social justice goals.
Right.
And so if CS expertise are just going to making military robots to supporting finance capital, like people aren't able to see those
Absolutely.
as actually benefiting their hometown, their household, their family. Like perhaps that's the equity that CS doesn't support equity.
Right.
The actual field of CS.
Right. Absolutely.
That's far and few between. It isn't oriented towards equity. So we're trying to say,
Absolutely.
let's do all this equity work in CS. And CS is like, yes, come on.
Right.
But at the end of the pipeline is injustice and inequity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. The Google hiring, right?
Yeah.
Validating the Google business model. You have representation, right? But you get there, like, nope, it's against our business model. We're not going to let you publish this work.
That's right.
And then we're just fired.
And to that point, again, thank you to the amazing grad students who I got to talk to this morning. One of the ideas that came out of that conversation is like, are we leading with the wrong value proposition for young people to inspire them to get into computing? Like, there are ways that you can use computing, like I'm preaching to the choir, to solve for problems that you actually care about. But we're not leading with that, right? We're leading with, or at least the field is leading with software engineering. Here are the jobs. Do you want to work at Facebook? Meta.
And I'd say that's just the voice, like, so like, I am a youth development, I work in development for a long time, so I always start with recruiting voices. Are we asking young people what they actually want? And they will tell us, we want to be able to change our community. When they have a chance to do it, I've literally, it's anecdotal, but I've seen for young ladies, programs that I hosted when I was at the Historical Society. When we started, she said, I don't want to stay in this city. I'm graduating, I'm coming to Michigan State. She had a full scholarship here. The one Michigan State, and I'm never coming back. By the end of that program, which was a week long, it was intensive, but it was a week long. understanding all the historical aspects of the uprising in 1967 and the impact that it had on their lives. She said, I'm coming back to Detroit because now I understand what role I play in this.
Mhm.
So, and that's, you know, we didn't pay her to say that. I didn't even say that. She said it to someone that was documenting it, you know, that experience. And I saw it on paper and believed it. But it really does make a significant difference. What are we talking to teachers about?
Mhm.
Are we having that conversation with them? What do parents have to say? When those voices are raised, that's when you can actually see more of a holistic type of change and a shift in the setting.
And then what would it mean to like MSU as a land grant institution? I mean, we started by making tax for white farmers, right, to build their wealth. What would it mean for MSU as a land grant institution to commit to putting CS education into the wealth of Black communities? Right? So that student can realize that dream, as opposed to right now, uphill battle to try to get money and get motivation, not
Right.
motivation, but to get the support to fulfill that motivation.
And then we're probably running out of time.
Okay, sure.
I'll make it quick, but like, I guess like to that point, like the framing of this overall, like to get at this, like this money and this. Like now we're like, so they come. Actually with the worldview that
Right.
we have. So we don't address our worldview in here, then we're going to continue to act in the pipeline army, no matter what we do, if we don't change our.
Excellent point. Thank you. Yes, I know. How much do I have? Like 2 more slides? Okay. So thank you. This is a wonderful conversation. Really appreciate the like thought-provoking reflection. It's actually making me think a lot too. So this is a quick summary of like how we see the challenges and then maybe some of the opportunities for a way forward. So I've hammered home the point about deep and systemic racial and socioeconomic inequality not being addressed. Incremental increases are prioritized as opposed to centering racial inequality in policies. So again, like, okay, Alabama has 80-something%, but like what's actually happening beneath that number? CS education can't be viewed as apolitical. Issues of race, power, and justice must be core to our teaching and learning. It can't be viewed as a nice to have, like for this only this track that wants to go into software engineering, but we need all students to have basic critical literacies. And maybe we start with that. Maybe we say basic critical computational literacies as opposed to computational and critical literacies. And then much more work is needed beyond preparation and thinking about inclusive environments in higher ed and in the workforce. Otherwise, no one's going to want to go on. I will skip these, but these are just like a snapshot of some of our projects at the Cape War Center. So you all probably have seen our culturally responsive framework. We're working on trying to figure out how do we implement these concepts in classrooms with teachers across school communities. Uphill battle, especially that point number 1 that we have to acknowledge racism in CS has been an interesting challenge working in certain states. Sapir Vakil is a wonderful colleague of ours. He's doing a project with young people having, to Kalisha's point, young people identifying what are some problems or what are some ethical issues in technology that they want to explore, and then creating curriculum that educators could use. So a really interesting way to like empower youth voice. I mentioned this earlier, a colleague of ours, Frida McAleer, who's focused on expanding CS for Native students and looking very specifically at individual tribes, languages, cultures, and thinking about how do we engage entire communities in conversations around computing. Many of you know Dr. Nikki Washington and Dr. Shani Daly at Duke. We're a partner with them in the ACE Alliance, which is trying to transform higher education as well. Many different challenges happening in, I think, as Aman mentioned, in like the sequence of courses for folks who are in computing fields. And then we have place-based efforts, really excited about our Detroit work in collaboration with Aman and Madison and Kalisha, and thinking about how do we work at the district level, how do we partner with out-of-school programs, teacher education programs, and work on policy and advocacy all at the same time. And then last but not least, I'm really excited about this, which is K-12 policy is just one piece of it, but we have 9 policy priority areas. We just launched this last month, and we want to call attention to the need to both expand access to tech pathways, but also promote tech accountability. So things like worker protections, I wish Danny was still here, whistleblower protections, gig worker safety and its unions, ensure tech companies are held accountable, combat the harmful consequences of AI and autonomous systems. So like these big picture issues in tech, like we have to be addressing those alongside of K-12 policy. And that leads us to the question to close. Again, as we think about what is the purpose of computer science education, this is a nice graphic from our colleagues at CS for All that articulated different ways that people articulate the importance and purpose of computer science. So we think it is incredibly important to think about reimagining CS education through a racial justice lens. That would include things like utilizing frameworks of racial inequity, addressing foundational disparities, building culturally responsive computer science instruction, deep investment, and this is from all types of funding sources in deep and ongoing teacher preparation. I think that's been a missing piece in computer science. Thank you to all of you for the amazing work that you do in the space. And then advocating for policies with intentionality around closing gaps. And the last one you can't quite see is Kalisha's amazing point around centering the perspectives of young people to build agency in classrooms and empower them. Okay, that's it. So thank you.
Well, thank you all for joining. Our next speaker will be Stephen Myers from the Department of Geosciences at University of Wisconsin-Madison on January 18th, Wednesday. All right, thank you again. Thank you, Dr. Scott.
Thank you so much for coming. Thanks for all of your input.
Everybody, don't forget, on the 14th of this month, create potluck. So sign up and come and enjoy. Good food, good conversation. We can continue that.
We have time for better food and workshops to stay and talk to Dr. Scott.
So much. Appreciate it.
For your amazing question. Critical question.